Robert Parry, founder and editor of Consortiumnews.com, joins us to discuss his article, Bernie Sanders as Commander-in-Chief. Mr. Parry, in the article, you discuss the recent campaign ad that Bernie Sanders ran in Hawaii, which features Representative and Iraq War vet Tulsi Gabbard expressing her support of Bernie Sanders, especially as the next Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. military. This is a real departure from what the Sanders campaign has been previously focused on. Up to now, he has remained steadfast in sticking to his domestic income inequality platform. But domestic and foreign policies are linked, as Gabbard points out in the ad, when she says, Sanders will defend our country and take the trillions of dollars that are spent on these interventionist regime change unnecessary wars and invest it here at home. Can you expound this point, because I think it's really important? In what ways does foreign policy impact domestic policy?
Well, many ways, because as we've seen since World War II, there has been a siphoning off of trillions upon trillions of dollars into what President Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex. And as President Eisenhower warned back in 1961, if you take that money away from schools and building up the country and put it into weapons, you're making a trade-off. And ultimately, the trade-off is not simply one of guns versus butter, but it's also one about democracy, because you end up fueling a lobby that can then alter the priorities of the U.S. government. And that was Eisenhower's rather prescient understanding of this situation. Of course, he, as a general in World War II, saw a lot of how that system could work. So you had Eisenhower making that warning, and really in the decades and generations since, his warning has not really been acted on. The United States has continued to build vast weapons systems at extraordinary cost and get involved in military adventures overseas that I think many people in retrospect would have thought were a mistake, like the Iraq War, for instance, or like the Vietnam War earlier, where the pressure to use military force becomes something that not only detracts from what's available for building up the country domestically, but also changes the political structure. It builds also a more militaristic or violent interventionist attitude among many people, especially among the elites in Washington. Because you have to remember that many of the think tanks where a lot of neocons and other ideologues go to work, these are paid for in part by the military-industrial complex, which gives them money. So what you have is a trade-off that has really gone against both keeping America domestically strong and allowing for a more open, fuller debate. Many people who have criticized war possibilities in the past have been easily marginalized as peaceniks or isolationists or apologists for this leader or that leader. So what we've seen is a destruction, really, of the whole freedom of speech and thought that is fundamental to a democracy. So those things all tie together, but there's also the practical sense, as Representative Gabbard said, of looking at the trillions of dollars spent on these interventionist wars in the last decade or two, and thinking that money could be spent to build the roads that are falling apart, and the bridges, and the schools, and all the other things that the American people need.
So you highlight in your article some of the distinctions Sanders seems to be drawing between himself and Hillary Clinton as the next commander-in-chief. Could you elaborate on some of those differences?
Well, basically Sanders has downplayed much of that difference. As you mentioned, he has tried to focus more on his issue of income inequality, and when foreign policy is raised, he has ceded that former Secretary of State Clinton has more experience than he does, but then he also points out that he voted against the Iraq War while she voted for it. He doesn't really take it much further than that. He hasn't really argued, as this ad does, that these interventionist regime change wars are unnecessary and are bleeding the wealth of the nation away from the things that need to be done. So he hasn't really put those two together before this ad that he had the Hawaiian Congresswoman do for his campaign there. So what you have is Sanders not having fully, I think, explained to the American people the risks involved in making Hillary Clinton either the nominee of the party or president and commander-in-chief. She has had a history, a record of supporting these interventionist wars and other regime changes. Not only was she supporting the Iraq War pretty much from 2002 until 2006, but she, as Secretary of State, she supported a coup d'etat against a progressive elected president in Honduras in 2009. She was pushing President Obama into what became very much a failed effort to do a counterinsurgency operation in Afghanistan, which was later abandoned. But 1,000 or so American soldiers died in the process, along with many Afghans. Then she supported and pushed Obama toward the intervention in Libya, which basically destroyed the Libyan military, led to the death and the torture murder of President Gaddafi, or Colonel Gaddafi, and then led to what has now become a failed state. Libya is a place where militias compete with each other, where ISIS has developed a base of operations, and where it's been difficult to pull anything together, and it's added to the troubles for Europe. Beyond that, she supported regime change in Syria. She's called for a no-fly zone, which would have required the U.S. military to bomb Syria's air force and air defenses, and could have paved the way for the either Al-Qaeda's Nusra Front or ISIS taking control of Syria. So she supported all these efforts to intervene around the world. And others. She was very much more aggressive on Iran than President Obama wanted her to be. So we've seen this pattern with Secretary Clinton, and it's one that raises serious questions about what would she be like as commander-in-chief without someone restraining her somewhat, as President Obama did when she was Secretary of State. And this is an issue that Senator Sanders has not really gone into. But it was raised finally, in this rather belatedly perhaps too late for his campaign, but raised in connection with the Hawaii caucuses that were held on Saturday, in which Senator Sanders did very well. He also did very well, of course, in Washington State and in Alaska. But it may be too late to turn this around, but it's certainly an issue that the Democrats should look at, whether or not Secretary Clinton is indeed the person they want to become Commander-in-Chief of the United States.
You mentioned that it may be too late, but I wonder if maybe this could be good timing, considering that we're now seeing other candidates start to talk about their foreign policy plans, especially Donald Trump with his recent New York Times interview.
Well, it's true. Sometimes candidates pick up on other topics as they go through the campaign. And sometimes the focus can be on domestic issues or foreign policy issues, and that changes. And certainly with some of the terrorism that's unsettling Europe, looking into those issues can be more important. Secretary Clinton has given a speech about how she would approach the issue of terrorism in a fairly tough, hawkish way. It could be time for Sanders to explain that sometimes taking the tough, hawkish position doesn't help, but actually makes things worse. Clearly, there's been, if you look at the quick history of this, this Islamist radicalism that we now know so well was really started in the 1980s when President Reagan thought it was a good idea to work with the Saudis to build up a jihadist force in Afghanistan to fight the then Soviet Union. While that was successful in part in driving the Soviet Union out of Afghanistan, what was left behind was the beginnings of this problem. The Taliban took over Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda that forms out of the international movement that was put together partly by the CIA to pressure the Russians. And so what they thought was a pretty clever idea back in the 1980s has turned out to be horrendous for the world's security. And we're not just now talking about disorder in the Middle East. We're talking about possibly destabilizing Europe, which has been one of the important stable areas in the world's economy. To have Europe be destabilized and perhaps even fall apart as a European Union that moves into very important strategic areas, both economically, politically, and militarily. So sometimes these efforts to achieve some short-term goal, even if it looks tough and is popular at the time, sometimes it has terrible consequences down the road. And I think that's the sort of thing that Senator Sanders really should focus on in terms of explaining how his views are different from Secretary Clinton's.
Robert Parry, thank you for your time and insight on this issue.
Thank you.